We're going to be talking a little bit about a story. I'm sure that shocks you, for me to be telling a story. I love stories. I love stories because they can entertain, they can teach, they can do a lot of things. I was racking my brain to think of a story that I could tell you to start this that's just kind of, I'm going to put this down just a little bit, that is just funny. I was working, I don't know how many of you know that I work with children on the autism spectrum. That is what I do every day. And I had a client in a classroom one day, and this was a fascinating young man. He often the things he said were not particularly connected to anything except what was just his thought process. He occasionally would look at me and say, he's a turtle that thinks he's a duck. What does that mean? I have no idea. But this was almost, on certain days, just a constant kind of a dialogue of disconnected statements or repeating something that he had heard on a cartoon or on TV or something else. And so, you know, that's just the way the day went, often. But one day I had my supervisor sitting next to me and observing what we were doing. I had the classroom teacher. I had an occupational therapist who was a good friend of mine. We were all crowded in this tiny little room and working. And this young man that often said these very strange things in very strange voices. And there was this lull in the classroom. And he moved over next to me. And in a very clear, absolutely lucid voice, he said to me, "You don't have any hair at all." And I thought, if for the moment of lucidity and absolute communication, I thought, you know, that wouldn't be what I would pick first off. But I love that story because I happen to be very fond of that young man, and he's doing very well. But I want to tell you about stories and storytellers and the subject of those stories, because we need to find ourselves in a story. And that's what makes them powerful. We find ourselves either wishing to be there or wishing not to be there. We find ourselves either sharing in common something with that person or amazed that we don't share something. And a story can connect us in ways that we don't even think about. And so I'm going to try to take a story that you know very well and find some ways, some different ways to connect you to it. But stories have more than just simply the person in the story. There are other people that sit on the periphery, including the listener. That's you today. But there's also the storyteller and his connection to the story itself. I often wonder if I would tell that story again about my young friend and it's actually one of the things that those staff members love to tell. They think that's hilarious. But they tell it differently than I do. I'm sure that's a shock. But the stories that we are connected to have within them the listener, the subjects of the story, and the storyteller. So let's start with the storyteller. Here's the storyteller. And storytellers take different forms. There's authors, there's historians, there's teachers, there's all kinds of people that use stories to convey a message. And in this particular idea was an author who was seeking more information on events that he was particularly involved in and particularly interested in. And he was directed to talk to an old man, maybe sitting off to the side, but someone that he says, you know, he has something on this topic that you need to hear. Okay. And the story is one that would have been very familiar to us. The man, when he was a boy, had been bullied, had been ostracized, had been ridiculed, isolated. He looked a little different than everybody else. In fact, he looked a lot different than everybody else. And because of that, his childhood was difficult. Connecting with friends and connecting with people was very difficult. And like many people, as we know this story, what happens next is that isolation becomes anger, becomes resentment, becomes something more. And it continues to grow, and this isolation and disconnect from the community in general becomes an opportunity for someone to take advantage. A group from outside that needed an insider and needed somebody there says, we need to talk. Why don't you come work for us? Except working for us meant working for people that weren't terribly nice. Led to extortion, theft, harm, violence. Not an unfamiliar story to anyone here, is there? But this story continues because this man that grew up now understands that he wants out. He wants to do something different. He wants to go a different way. Wants to change his life. But how do you do that when all your connections in the community are those of violence and criminals and the enemy? How do you do that? How do you do it when you look so different and everybody treats you so differently? How do you do it when you are pretty much a pariah in your own hometown? Even though he had grown wealthy, very wealthy, he still knew he was missing something else in his life, but he had no idea how to change. And then the opportunity presented itself. That opportunity was coming into town. But there's a problem. He couldn't see. The title of this sermon is, I Can't See. So he does something pretty extraordinary. And guess what? He found a way. The story ends with someone that said, I'm going to be different. Not in the way I look and not in the way that I've acted all these years, but I'm going to be different from this day forward and change my life. That's a cool story, isn't it? It should be really familiar to many people. Maybe even to you personally. But the thing is that story of someone that was leading a very wicked path, who needed to change but didn't know how. In fact, he was almost denied the opportunity to change because of the circumstances. But he took an amazing risk. Everybody recognize the story? Let me give you a hint, and you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree, the Savior for to see. Anybody want to finish it? And as the Savior walked that way, he looked up in the tree and said, oh, come on, you can do better than that. That's right. And we love that story. We teach it to the kids, and I tried to remember all the hand gestures that go with it, and it's been a long time since I taught Sunday school, so I couldn't remember. But that's all right. What does that story have to do with us? It's a cute story. It's a powerful story. But that is right there is about as far as we go in the story. But have we ever thought of the things that connect the front and the back of that? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. What does that mean? Well, teach you a new word today. Achondroplasia. In my work with children with disabilities, we learn all these really cool names of things, but there's, and most of them I can't remember, but it just so happens that this is one that I had some experience with, and it stuck in my head, achondroplasia. We call people with this particular syndrome, we've used words like midget, we've used words like dwarf. They prefer to be called little people, but we're familiar with that phenomenon, right? The popular TV show that came on a few years ago following the lives of a couple of families were actually filmed in the town where my kids grew up. And in fact, one of those kids went to high school, and middle school and high school with my kids. These were people we saw quite often and knew them. So that word, when I learned that word, kind of stuck. But think about being a little person in the first century. How would you be treated? How would you make friends? Can you understand how easy it would be for Zacchaeus to be isolated, bullied, intimidated? And how did he respond? Being isolated and picked on and all the things, he reached out to the only people that must possibly paid him any attention, and that happens to be the Romans, looking for inside information on taxing a wealthy community in this occupied land that happened to be Jericho. An insider that would know where Uncle Bob hid the extra grain that he may have harvested, or where the money was kept hidden behind the cabinet. And the soldiers, as they searched for taxes, he would go, look over there, that's where it is. They hated the publicans. They hated the tax collectors. They were traitors to Israel. So the man that looked different, the man that they had mistreated probably as a boy, and here he is, has aligned himself with the enemy. In fact, he's been so successful that they have made him the chief tax collector. Oh, going down the street and how much he was hated, how much he was despised, how much he was mocked. But somewhere in that man was a desire to change. How do you change? How do you escape all of that? He heard about Jesus. In fact, when you read the account in Luke 18, is that just outside of town, Jesus had healed a blind man. And the excitement probably was already sweeping into town. Do you know who's about to be here? Do you know who's coming? Do you know who's... Because the people were already lining the streets. Jesus is coming. This one who may be the Messiah, who may be the hope of Israel, the one that speaks of forgiveness and love. And Zacchaeus, the rich trader, wanted out. Except he couldn't see. Everybody piling into the road and everybody standing there, and this is why I believe that he probably was a little person. He couldn't see. But an adult climbing a tree, I'd like to think that it's a tree that he probably climbed as a boy. If you go to Jericho today, they will point to a sycamore tree that's very, very old and right on the side of the road, and you get, for a certain fee, I think, you get to take a picture with Zacchaeus' tree. It's kind of one of those, Washington slept here kind of signs, right? But I'd like to think that. He climbs the tree. Could this be my hope? Could this be my escape? Could this be the way to change? How wonderful. But no, he wouldn't stop. He wouldn't know me. He wouldn't care for me. Well, maybe, he's got this guy named Matthew that's with this group of disciples. And he, like Zacchaeus, was a publican, a tax collector. Could it be? Is he holding on to the thinnest thread? And maybe if I can see him and know what he looks like, and maybe at some point in time I can find a way to talk to this one and give me some idea of hope and forgiveness and mercy and love. Except something remarkable happens. Jesus stops. Zacchaeus, I'm eating at your house today. And he comes down, and they're walking along the road, and immediately the ripple through the crowd. He is associating with this wicked man. And yet in my mind, and when I hear this story, I see none of that in the face of Jesus. As he says, I'm with you today. What do you want to know? What do you want? What answers do you want? How can I serve you? And Zacchaeus says, as he's walking along the road, before they're ever even home, half of my wealth, which was probably considerable, I will give to the poor. And if I have hurt anybody, I'll pay them 4 times back. Jesus says salvation has come to your home, come to this place, come to you. And Zacchaeus became a believer. Now we skip years ahead. Because where I began telling the story was with an author talking to an old man. Because the account is recorded in Luke 19. And we know from the beginning of the book of Luke is that Luke went after the eyewitnesses of what went on around Jesus so that he could write with authority and with conviction and with truth back to Theophilus to say what you believed is truth. So he talked to people. I believe that when you read the accounts, I believe he talked to Mary, the mother of Jesus. I believe he talked to, I'm sure he talked to Peter. But there were others. And maybe one of them, years after he climbed a tree, was a little guy by the name of Zacchaeus. And there he was, decades later, with the believers, saying, let me tell you about the day that Jesus extended to me hope, forgiveness, compassion, love. And I sit and listen to the storyteller, Luke. And through his eyes, I see the story of Zacchaeus. And I'm left with a problem. And here's where we're going to go just a little bit off the path. What does this have to do with us? Have you ever thought about that? I love the story. Knew the song. Learned it as a child. Taught it to mine. But what does it have to do with us? What do we learn from that story? We teach our children the compassion of Jesus as he stops and looks at this man and says, come join me. We're gonna talk. We're going to have dinner. We're going to do this. And we leave out the part where he says, I'm going to fix the fraud that I have committed and some of the other things that are there. We kind of leave that part out, but that's okay. It's Sunday school. But what about us? Let me ask you this question. If you were going to be a part of this story, what part would you take? Well, a whole lot of people have a hard time trying to think of themselves as Zacchaeus. I'm not a bad person. We could talk about sin and forgiveness and things like that, but Zacchaeus is a little tough to get to. Clearly, we're not going to take the role of Jesus. Are we going to take the role of the crowd as they were astonished and shocked and horrified that Jesus would speak to and even go into the home of Zacchaeus? I sure hope not. But what role would you like to play? There's one character in this story that we almost never talk about. And I'm going to challenge you that this is your role. Each of us, has the capacity to be the tree. Now think about that. Are you a tree? Zacchaeus couldn't see. He could not meet Jesus. He was isolated, both from the community and because he's a little guy. He can't see. He can't know. He can't connect with Jesus except for a sycamore tree, a tree. Now, I'm going to tell you that tree did not have a lot of skill sets. It wasn't particularly talented. But I'll tell you what it was. It was in the right place for a man to climb its branches, to be able to see over, to see Jesus. To see Jesus for the first time. Are you a tree? Because there's lots of people out there that have not seen Jesus. Now they're going to make up their own mind. Jesus is going to speak to them through God's word. If we are faithful and can do what we can to make that connection, but we have to start with being a tree that a person in this world that can't see Jesus can climb to go, oh, that's what he looks like. That's what he's saying. That's what it means. And then they decide, what are they going to do? A tree. How simple is that? We are charged in John 15 of bearing fruit for God. Immediately, many people that are Christians for a long time kind of seize up. Oh, I can't teach a Bible class. I can't talk to strangers. I'm telling you from personal experience that that's the way I felt. Let me tell you the sidebar here. One of the most magical things about David Jackson, our friend that's not living around us anymore, but many of us stay in contact with. And I've known David 30-something years, 40 years, okay? The most amazing thing about David Jackson, he can talk to anybody. I wish I had that talent. And he takes that opportunity to talk to somebody and say, hey, you know, how he turns it on a plane, in a grocery store, at the hardware store, next to his mailbox. I don't know if you know this story, but let me share it with you just briefly. We're talking about stories. David Jackson became a Christian. He and Sharon. And changed their life in such a radical way that a year later, a chance encounter with his next-door neighbor, I think around the garbage can, if I remember right, them rolling their trash out to the road. And his neighbor says, I got to ask you, what in the world happened to you? What happened to you? You're so different. And David went, let me tell you. That guy was a fellow by the name of Rob Fox, no kin to. Interestingly enough, both in the medical field, but don't let me go there. But Rob and Lori started having a Bible class. Was introduced to a Bible teacher, had started Bible class, became Christians. Rob Fox is an elder in the church now. What was David Jackson? He was a tree, a springboard, a viewport. I don't know what you want to call it, but an ability and an opportunity for show someone what and who Jesus is. Just change the point of view. And here's Jesus walking down the road. And that view would not have been possible if it wasn't for the tree. Rob and Lori Fox and their kids, their middle child, ended up marrying a Marine and was stationed for a few years out with us in California. And I got to meet Mike and got to know their girls and stay in touch with them. And I knew them when she was a little girl, 7 or 8 years old, and now her kids are going into high school. How did that happen? I'll tell you, it happened because David Jackson was a tree. The story of Zacchaeus is not disconnected from us. Because I can't play every role. But I can be a tree. Lift up somebody. I'm going to tell you, here's the plug, okay? That's what we're trying to do with the podcast. Do you want to preach? Do you want to teach a Bible class? Do you feel like that's going to be your strength? Maybe not. But what you can do is take your phone and hit like, share. And somebody comes to you and goes, well, that was interesting. How's that connected to you? Funny you should ask. I got somebody you need to meet. Really nice guy, tall, good looking. His name's Adam. And he can tell you all about it. Be a tree. It's all we can do sometimes. Hold someone up high enough that they can look in the face of Jesus and see hope. A story we don't often talk about. So in just a minute, we're going to sing an invitation song, and I'd like for you to consider where you stand in your relationship with God. How can we serve you? Because let me tell you what the elders and the deacons and everyone here wants to be. We want to be your tree. How can we help you? It may be that you've never become a child of God. We take this opportunity to do that. Or you need to know more. Oh, wouldn't that be a great conversation? How can we serve your needs? If there is some way, why don't you come up front while we stand and sing our invitation song?